I think acrylic ink is the best ink for drawing, and it works really well with dip pens. But you can also use Indian ink, and you can even use fountain pen ink or watercolor ink. This video is part 2 in this series on dip pens. Part 1 was about nibs and nib holders. Part 3 will be about techniques for pen and ink drawing. In this video, I'll really only talk about black ink on white paper, but you can also use white ink and colored ink, and you can work on black paper or toned paper. So you have a lot of options with dip pens. Black ink on white paper is a classic, and I think it looks fantastic. When is a dip pen not a dip pen? Well, a lot of these inks come in bottles with droppers, and actually you don't need to dip a dip pen. You can use the dropper to load it with ink if you want to. I like to do that, but sometimes I also like to dip. If you dip it, it's a good idea to dip it only up to the hole in the nib so you don't overload it with ink, which can drip onto your paper. It's also a good idea to tap it to get rid of any excess ink, and also to test it on some scrap paper to make sure it's not about to drop a blob of ink when you flex it. Rather than using the ink straight from the bottle, you may want to use an inkwell or something similar. This is a good idea if you want to dilute your ink with water to make it flow better, and if you don't want to dilute the whole bottle, or you want to mix 2 or more colors together. I often like to have some diluted ink that I can dip the tip into. This is because the tip can dry out. The nib will seem to be out of ink, but if you just shallowly dip the tip, the ink will start flowing again from higher up on the nib. To clean the ink off the nib, I use water, a toothbrush, and kitchen towel. The toothbrush is especially useful for nibs with reservoirs. It's a good idea to tap the nib to get rid of any excess water which can get trapped inside the nib holder and can come flooding out later to ruin your drawing. After that, I dry it with kitchen towel. I like to clean my nibs quite often while drawing, and not only at the end of a drawing session. If you keep your nibs clean and dry, you probably won't get any rust or built-up ink on the tip or the tines. They'll work well, and they'll last a long time. Inks are either pigment-based or dye-based. You want a pigment-based ink. Pigments are generally more light-fast than dyes. A lot of fountain pen inks are dye-based, so watch out for those, but some are pigment-based, such as platinum carbon ink. Acrylic ink and Indian ink are almost always pigment-based, as far as I've seen, and there are also pigment-based watercolor inks. Pigments are often labeled with a code, such as PBK7. A lot of black inks are made with PBK7, which is often called carbon black or lamp black, and this pigment is extremely light-fast. You can get PBK7 as an acrylic ink, Indian ink, fountain pen ink, and watercolor ink. So then the main difference between these inks is not really the pigment, but the binder. The binder is the thing that the pigment is suspended in, and the thing that binds the pigment onto the paper when it dries. For an ink to be archival, it basically needs to be 2 things: light-fast and permanent. Light-fastness is basically a property of the pigment. Permanence is basically a property of the binder. But I should say that this is my understanding as an artist, not as a scientist. Acrylic ink uses an acrylic binder, and that makes it really very permanent. It's water resistant when dry, so it won't wash away if your drawing gets wet, and it won't suffer as much from humidity. These are 2 acrylic inks that I use: Liquitex Carbon Black and Holbein Super Opaque Black, both of which use PBK7, but you could also try FW Black acrylic ink, which comes in the best bottles. Holbein does not, and I transferred my Holbein acrylic ink into an old FW bottle. This Liquitex Black is basically a shading ink, and even if used thickly, it's just not as dark as this Holbein ink, even though they use the same pigment. Holbein Super Opaque Black is really super opaque, and you can dilute it a lot without it going gray. Unlike acrylic ink, Indian ink traditionally uses shellac as a binder, but some manufacturers use something else these days, and they just call it Indian ink. So in this video, when I say Indian ink, I mean traditional Indian ink with a shellac binder, such as this ink made by Winsor & Newton, or this ink made by Speedball. Indian ink has most of the same advantages as acrylic ink, but I think it has some disadvantages. For one thing, shellac is not vegan. It's made from a resin secreted by an insect called the lac bug, which is native to India, among other places. Indian ink also seems to me to dry slower and thicker than acrylic ink, which can make it easier to smudge. But I'm hesitant to say that this is necessarily a difference between these inks, because you will probably want to dilute your ink with a little bit of water, and that will change its drying time and thickness, so it's not necessarily fair or useful to compare these inks straight out of the bottle. Watercolor ink uses gum arabic as a binder, and it's not waterproof, so that makes it arguably less archival than acrylic ink or Indian ink. But because it's not waterproof, you can also reactivate it later to create some interesting effects. You can also make your own inks by adding water to solid watercolor paints or gouache paints, and using a dropper or a brush to load your dip pens. Gouache is opaque watercolor, and it's been widely used for calligraphy with dip pens. Some inks have additives that make them flow better. Some fountain pen inks, such as platinum carbon black, flow really well, maybe even too well. If you want thicker lines, or lines that swell from thin to thick, then you may be better off with the thicker ink that doesn't flow as well. Thin inks can easily flood your paper when you press down on your nib when you're making a wider line. If that happens, then you may make a mess, and you may have to dip your pen more often because you're using more ink. Even so, I sometimes like to use platinum carbon black with dip pens, so I can use dip pens in the same drawings as fountain pens. Some nibs seem to work better with some inks than others. For example, I find it difficult to get some inks to start flowing from my Gillette 659 Crow Quill, but it's easier with platinum carbon and Liquitex, both of which flow really well straight from the bottle. If your ink doesn't flow well, dilute it with water. Distilled water, especially with Indian ink. When I started using Indian ink, I used tap water, and my ink got clumpy or gloopy, for lack of a better term. I use distilled water now, and I don't seem to have that problem. Some nibs can be wetter than others. In other words, they use more ink to make a line of the same width as another nib. If you use a flexible nib to get a thick line, you'll often get more ink on the paper, and it'll often take longer to dry than it will if you make a thin line with the same nib, or even if you make a thick line with a different nib, such as an ornamental nib. So be careful that you don't smudge it with your hand before it dries. Thick lines can dry with a different texture or sheen than thinner lines. It's not necessarily a problem, and I guess it's part of the charm of an original pen and ink drawing, but I was surprised when I first saw it. Some inks do this more than others. For example, Holbein Super Opaque Black is really matte, and it doesn't really do this as much as other inks. It's also really good for filling large areas with black if you want them to have an even sheen. Inks behave differently on different papers. The paper that seems to be most widely recommended for pen and ink is a smooth Bristol board. Pointed nibs are less likely to catch on smoother papers, so that's one reason they're widely recommended. You can also get a smoother line on a smoother paper, which is another reason. I use Bristol boards made by Winsor & Newton or Hanamulla, and they work very well, but there are other well-known brands that will probably work just as well. I've tried some other cheaper brands that have problems with feathering, so watch out for that. You can also use a hot-pressed watercolor paper, which is smooth and which is probably better than Bristol board if you also want to add washes of watered-down ink with a brush. You can also use a rougher paper to get a slightly broken line, and that can be really beautiful. One of the most widely recommended watercolor papers is made by Arches, which may be pronounced Arch, but I like the sound of Arches better. You can get both cold-pressed and hot-pressed surfaces, and both are great for pen and ink work, but these papers tend to be more expensive than Bristol boards. Most watercolor papers have sizing, which is traditionally a kind of glue that helps to protect the paper from the water and helps the paint to absorb evenly across the paper. Sizing is great if you want to use watercolor or watered down ink together with your pen and ink, but it also seems to change the behavior of the ink. The ink may take longer to dry, and I seem to get thinner lines on papers with hard sizing, such as Arches. Also, the sizing on some papers, such as Arches, is gelatin, so it's not vegan, but there are vegan options. For a paper to be called archival, it basically needs to be two things: acid-free and lignin-free. But this is an oversimplification, and again, this is my understanding as an artist, not a scientist. Arches paper is made from 100% cotton fibers, and this is considered to be the most archival kind of paper because it's naturally acid-free and lignin-free. Most papers are made from wood fibers. Even if they're acid-free, they're often not lignin-free. There are supposedly lignin-free papers that are not 100% cotton, such as those Bristol boards that I showed you. But this information is usually only available on websites and not on product packaging, even though the packaging says acid-free, so that makes this information seem less trustworthy. But these papers are well behaved with pen and ink, and they're often much cheaper than 100% cotton papers, so I think they're well worth trying. If you don't care about how long your drawing will last, you can use printer paper, which is cheap and which is able to handle thin applications of ink, but does cockle or buckle with thick applications of ink or watered down ink. Printer paper is great for practicing, but I would recommend something more archival, like a good quality Bristol board or watercolor paper for finished artwork, and something heavier like 250 or 300 GSM. There are so many combinations of ink and paper and so many different interactions between ink thickness and nib wetness that you really need to try some things for yourself, but I hope this video has given you some ideas of what to try. Acrylic ink on Bristol board is a good place to start, but there are a lot of other things to try, so have fun, and please like and subscribe, and keep an eye out for part 3 in this series. Please also let me know in the comments if you have any favorite combinations of nib, ink, and paper. Thanks for watching!